Welcome, everybody, to our commission meeting today. If we could begin by each commissioner present introducing themselves. Sandy.
Good afternoon, everyone, Chair and fellow commissioners and the public. My name is Sandy Ma, and I'm with Common Cause Hawaii. Welcome.
Thank you. Kristen.
Good afternoon, Kristen Izumi Tao, Executive Director, Campaign Spending Commission. Thank you for coming to our afternoon session.
Janet.
I'm Janet Mason. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Hawaii.
Barbara.
Barbara Maramoto, retired legislator.
Okay, and I'm Dan Foley, the chair, retired state judge, and we have a couple of commission members who've been excused and not present today. We'll begin with the minutes. I thought we had approved, I guess we had approved our April 14 minutes by email, but we didn't formally approve them in last commission meeting. So if there are no objections, we'll deem the April 14 minutes approved. No objections, approved. And as far as the June 1 minutes, I'll defer that until the next meeting. Our vice chair, Robert Harris, has been in the mainland, so he's been unable to review and get back to us on that. So I'll put the June 1 minutes on our next meeting agenda. And with that, we'll move on to public testimony. We'll begin with anybody present who wishes to testify. Okay. So we'll go online then. If we could have our first witness.
Can you raise your hand? People online, can the people online raise their hand in the virtual room if you'd like to testify? Person can call.
And we had asked, we've received written testimony from many, if not most of you, which we have read and will read. We'll accept written testimony from you on the topics under today's meeting or any other topic after this meeting. But for today, I would ask each person to try to limit their oral testimony to 3 minutes within the scope of the issues today on voting and elections and related matters. With that, our first witness.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Chair Foley and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity. I did submit somewhat lengthy written testimony. I apologize. But one thing I did want to touch base on in my oral testimony is that I think since your last meeting, the Democratic Party of Hawaii did adopt a resolution 2022-40.A regarding or urging the state legislature to take anti-corruption safeguards. And I'm sorry, that's not the exact title, but it's in my testimony. But one of the points that was included in the actions the Democratic Party urged the legislators to take is to address this one point, which many points, but one in particular regards individuals who are lawmakers who hold leadership positions, but they also work or employed privately as private practice attorneys, or they may be profit sharing partners in a law firm. But as some on this committee may know, there is a thing called attorney-client privilege, and that is held by the client, which from my understanding, it means that the attorney / lawmaker may not disclose who their clients are, what their businesses are, without prior written consent from their client. So what happens is we, the public, may not know if the lawmaker is introducing bills or, killing bills or passing bills or helping it along without knowing who else could be paying them for this legal representation. Like, how do we know when when a lawmaker is wearing what hat they're wearing in that particular. And there's, again, because of the attorney-client privilege, it's not like they could stand up in the middle of a hearing and say, I have a financial conflict of interest. So these are the issues that I think I would like this committee to clarify, call in some legal experts, call in the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, figure out how do we resolve this. Up to this moment, the Democratic Party, again, passed a resolution saying that they should, if you've been in private practice for the preceding 6 months, you should not hold a leadership position. And I think that might be my 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions for Kim Coco? Janet?
I
Barbara?
don't think so.
Hello, Kim.
Hi.
Barbara Marmoto from.
Oh, hi. Yes,
10
hi,
years with the-
Representative. Of course, hi.
I have been retired for 10 years, so been out of it, but I noticed that you think legislators should be covered by the state sunshine laws.
Yes, I
And,
do.
but my understanding is the legislature is not covered by the sunshine law. Maybe you can clarify.
Yes, from my understanding, thank you. From my understanding, when the legislature enacted the Sunshine Law for all of its righteous reasons, they said, oh, but we exempt the legislature from these transparency requirements, which then allows, for instance, it allows legislators to meet, multiple legislators to meet and agree on how they're going to vote on an issue. It allows them to meet in caucus and to all agree before they get into the decision-making procedure, how they're going to vote. And all of these things, and I'm familiar with the Sunshine Law because when I was elected to the Board of Education, we had to comply. We could not make decisions outside of the public. We could not do serial kind of checking in with every legislature, every board member one-on-one before a vote is made. So we couldn't do certain things, and yet we were able to make decisions and be criticized for the decisions we made and how we got to some of those decisions. And I think the public deserves that.
I think you're right. The public does deserve sunshine. So the Democratic Party is in favor of the legislature being covered by the sunshine law.
That's according to the resolution that was adopted by the body at this most recent convention, that was one of the elements. Yes, not just the Sunshine Law, but the state ethics laws as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the legislature constructively defined state employees to not include legislators. Even though they get, all the benefits of being a state employee, they're not held to the same kind of, yeah.
Okay, I have a question about your first point that you made regarding lawyers and those who are involved with a profit sharing partner in a law firm. You talked about House leadership. Do you feel that, or not House, legislative leadership, do you think this should cover just leadership positions?
Well, it's right now the way the bodies operate. I would say that those who are in leadership positions have the most discretion. And then you pair that with the sunshine exemption. There's a lot that can be done unilaterally. And again, if the body is managed in such a way by leadership to basically, punish legislators who speak out against leadership, and therefore, so if somebody wants to say, hey, this doesn't feel right, why are we doing it this way? There would be consequences for the things that they're working on and want to move forward. So I think it takes an outside body to kind of put this on the table and to call it out. Truthfully, this one item has been eye-opening for a lot of people. I think a lot of people took this for granted. I don't, so I think a lot of people didn't realize that this is the way it could be done. And one of the things that brought this to my attention was when legislative leadership, those lawmakers who were part of leadership, were arrested for bribery. And it made me realize that had those legislators been attorneys, And they said, oh, I will take that, envelope as cash, and I will consider it a retainer for legal services. And it's just, could they have gotten away? Would they still be in the legislature today? And I would argue that yes, they would be.
I'm a little puzzled as to, what leadership positions you're referring to, whether it includes chairman or vice chairman or, the majority.
I think anyone has a
Speaker.
kind of unilateral power and authority to make certain decisions and to exercise.
I
And
will simply point out that as a former minority, House minority leader,
right.
I did not have much power.
Good point. I mean, and that's maybe it needs to be clarified, but I think the intent and the understanding is there. We could wordsmith it. I think, your body can wordsmith your recommendations, but I think something needs to be done and something needs to be clarified.
Thank you for pointing out this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sandy, Kristen, do you have any questions?
Sandy's her hand up.
Okay, if not, thank you very much, Kim Coco.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining us. Our next
Thank you.
witness.
Sandy has her hand up. Sandy, did you have something you needed to say? No? Sandy, we can't hear you if you're trying to talk.
I'm sorry, were you talking to me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Sandy, you have your hand up. Did you need to say something?
I do. I wanted to give some remarks during the public testimony phase because someone had called Common Cause and wanted to have me relay some remarks, but I could go after Gary Hoosier.
Like Gary to go first?
Yeah, Gary,
Yes.
thanks for
Okay.
joining us again, Gary. You're
Thank-
on.
Thank you. I'm on. Thank you, Sandy, for letting me go forward. I'll get a judge and a commission. I applaud you for spending the time. I know it's a lot of work, meetings every couple of weeks, and in between you've got to do the reading. I'll keep my remarks brief. I did send in two separate pieces of testimony. The main one focuses on support of term limits. And I have not always been in support of term limits, but have come to the conclusion that the situation now, the barriers are so high to entry for new candidates, so incredibly high. I spend a good part of my life right now trying to support new candidates, people who want to run that are qualified. And when they find out that they need to raise 30 or 40,000 just to get out the box, they're intimidated by it. And so ultimately, public funded elections is a goal I want to talk about later when it's appropriate at a future meeting. But without term limits, we have the chair of Ways and Means who has over $900,000 in his campaign spending account. And that effectively prevents anyone at all, no matter how good or bad, from running against them. And so the barriers for new candidates are huge. Incumbents have such an advantage with money, with name recognition. They spend their legislative expense accounts, if you would, for flyers, constituent communications. I think that falls under the fair practices. That should be banned at least 90 days before any election. I know for a fact incumbent candidates put off declaring for office as long as they can so they can do as many of those communications as they can before they file and then have to run for office properly. And I'll hold off on that. There's just the barrier of entries are so high. The legislators control the money for unions, so therefore they control a lot of the endorsements. They control capital CIP monies. People are afraid to speak out against them. And in closing, I'll say the arguments that I hear against it are we don't want to lose expertise. Well, there's plenty of people that would love to pound on the door and add their expertise. And it might take a year, a session, maybe 2 sessions to understand what's going on, but it shouldn't take you more than 2 sessions. 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever that limit might be, is plenty of time. And the other one is that the staff will take over somehow. And I've spent 16 years in public office. I know it's not going to happen. Council members have limits, mayors and governor has limits, and I think it's time right now to let the people decide and vote on whether the legislature should have term limits. So thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Gary. Janet, Barbara, any questions for Gary?
I don't think so.
Uh,
Thank you.
Kristen or Barbara?
Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
No, I don't have questions. I was just thanking him for his
Oh.
comments.
Thank you.
Gary, I'd like to ask you about term limits. I mean, you served 16 years. I happen to serve 34 years. And, but I think I've finally come around to the position where I think term limits would kind of shake up the process a little bit. And you mentioned 8, 10, or 12 years. And I think that might be better than 6 years, which California adopted. And I think what happened then in California was that the legislators were learning the process first couple of years, and then the second term they were gunning for chairmanship, and the third term, when they'd be the last term, they'd be gunning for the Senate for another office. And on my understanding is that it gave one staff an inordinate amount of power with some knowledgeable staff members and in key positions. And two, it gave lobbyists an inordinate amount of power because they knew the process pretty well. And so I'm just wondering if you might want to comment on that. You know, so some people are saying we should have term limits of 6 years or 8 years.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Representative. I spent 6 years at the county council. I mean, 8 years on the county council and 8 years in the Senate. 8 years is the most common term I think I hear people talking about, the limit. I recognize that to be vested, I believe for retirement, 10 years is the magic number. And so I personally, I'd be okay with 10 years or 12 years when you're looking at 4-year terms, 3 4-year Senate terms. But right now there's nothing, you know, it's 20, it's 30 years of entrenchment. The bright stars, in my opinion, are the people that are on their second term. They've gotten comfortable with their first term, they've learned the ropes, and now they want to make things happen. Without term limits, in my opinion, I've seen legislator after legislature become complacent. They just need to stay there, protect themselves, and they get stronger. Every year they get stronger. Every year they raise more money. Every year they get more name recognition. With the term limit, it forces you to get your stuff done. You know, get yourself done. I mean, you know, if you can't do it in 8 years or 10 years, then maybe you should be doing something else. And I'm personally also okay with setting out or running for something else later. Just break the cycle. I don't believe it has to be a forever myself, but I think the voters should ultimately decide. And I would push back against the idea of staff having too much power. I haven't seen that. I really haven't on the council level.
And you talked about the power of money and the power of unions. And I'm wondering whether you could expand on those comments.
Well, I'll basically cut to the chase. You know, the chair of Ways and Means and the chair of Finance and that committee control the budgets of public workers. You know, when money comes to give teachers more money or anyone more money, that's up to those individuals. And those are the same organizations that endorse candidates. And it goes with any special interest. They want to support and help those that are supporting them. And so that's, at the end of the day, the people in the power retain the power. And I believe that it's not because, with no, I don't mean any disrespect to the people holding those positions, but it's not because they are necessarily the best and the brightest. You have to be very competent to hold those positions, there's no question. But it's because of their longevity. It's because of that money they have in the bank that no one's going to challenge them. and it's because of the power they wield. And I think we need to break that power. If we had a robust public funding program to allow new candidates to come in, maybe I wouldn't feel so strongly about this. And I have to say, it's not, I'm pushing back against a lot of my friends who quite frankly will say, well, that's a Republican idea. And I'm happy to say, well, just because Republicans like it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. And that we should do it. Let the people decide ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you very much for testifying.
Sandy, did you have a question for Gary?
I don't have a question. I just want to relay a comment from the public.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. So Common Cause received a call from a member of the public. This member of the public did not feel comfortable directly emailing this commission for whatever reason the public member had, and wanted me to convey the sentiments directly to the commission. This public member stated that this commission should audit the bills of Senator English and Representative Cullen, even though that I let the public person know that this was not within our HR 9 directive. But I just thought I relayed that they thought the charge was that we should audit the bills of former Senator English and former Representative Cullen, and also that this commission should take a look at how empty seats are filled when a person has to resign. That's something that should be looked at, that when an empty seat is filled, the person that's resigned still has control over how the seat is filled and could exert influence in how that seat is filled. And so those are just comments I'm relaying to this commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Go ahead, Janet.
Sandy, did this person suggest time limits for the audit?
No, just auditing the bills that have been introduced in the past, but no time frame
Okay,
for
thank
the
you.
audit.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Rona, do we have any more witnesses? If no more witnesses, thank you. We'll move on, or public testimony. We'll move on to item number 4, discussion of reforms related to elections and voting. And Janet Mason, with the help of Sandy Ma, is going to take the lead on this, beginning with the issue of term limits. Would you like to go, Janet?
Thank you, Chair Foley. As you will see, the commission was provided a very long list of topics of discussion. I believe it's on the next slide. And we thank everyone who suggested topics. We received some suggestions from the commissioners themselves and others from the general public. The first 3 suggestions in red were received from commissioners very early on. And that gave us an opportunity to recruit outside experts really to help us reviewing those topics. We may find as the discussion goes on that some of the topics in this list are a little bit tenuous in terms of elections and voting and the relationship to opportunities for improved conduct. But certainly there's no doubt at all about the importance of elections and voting in this context. Sandy, I think you wanted to make a comment here.
So I just wanted to add that the next 3 after the red bullet points are in purple, and they have to do with prohibiting agents of candidates from assisting voters, adopting a code of fair campaign practices, and remedies for faithless electors. Those 3 in purple are more prescriptive, like prohibiting certain conducts, and that's why they are lumped together. And then the next 3 after that don't really have much rankings or collective agreement between the 3, and so that's why they are the last 3 in a row. Thank you.
This may be a good point to mention that I may offer another topic for discussion later on. With that, let's turn to our first speaker, Jessica Jones Caparel, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., where she's employed by the League of Women Voters of the United States and has responsibility for both lobbying, training the volunteer corps of lobbyists, and she's an integral part of developing the League's national positions on different policy issues. Thank you for joining us, Jessica. It's already 8 o'clock on the East Coast. But as you can see, there was a lot of interest among the testifiers on the question of term limits.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you so much to the commission. I'm very excited to be here today to talk with you all. As Janet said, I'm Jessica Jones Caparel, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the League of Women Voters of the United States. The League of Women Voters of the United States is a century-seasoned, nonpartisan, nonprofit voting rights and democracy forward organization. We're a grassroots group with more than 500,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our affiliate network includes over 700 local, regional, and state level leagues that together work to empower voters and defend democracy. The League focuses on issue research, civic education, and advocacy to achieve our mission to empower voters and defend democracy. As an organization, the League carefully considers its public policy positions. Positions are adopted through member understanding and agreement. After careful study, members come to consensus around an issue, and a position is developed for use at the national, state, and local levels. I'm here this afternoon, your time, evening for me, to talk about the concept of term limits. And my hope is to provide you with a broad overview of the history of term limits, talk about the arguments that opponents and proponents make, while also outlining the League's stance on this policy. So let's get into it. Term limits have been debated for centuries. At the federal level, term limits are imposed on the president by, of course, the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution, which says that no person can be elected president of the United States more than twice. President George Washington informally initiated this process, but it was not until 1947 that an amendment to the Constitution attached the legal limit on presidential power. Term limits were also used by the Confederate States of America when it established a 6-year-long limit on how long its president could serve. Congressional term limits have been featured prominently, or were featured prominently, in the Republican Party's contract with America and during the 1994 US House election campaign. After winning back the US House for the first time since the 1952 elections, Republican leadership brought a constitutional amendment that would have limited the term of service for US House members to 6 2-year terms and to members of the Senate to 2 6-year terms to the floor. The amendment failed to reach the required 2/3 vote needed in the House. The issue was able to be debated in the House again, but it never achieved the required votes to pass, and the idea seems to have lost steam at the federal level. Although the issue lost steam at the federal level, implementation of term limits did occur at the state and local levels. According to information from Ballotpedia, since the 1990s, 21 states have favorably moved toward term limits. However, 6 of those states have had the term limits overturned, either by the state courts or they have been extended through a legislative or referendum process. The states that have term limits are both red and blue states. They range from Maine to Massachusetts to Florida, Arizona, Missouri, and back to California. Although national Republicans led the movement for term limits at the federal level, the state trend appears to have been conducted in states with all political affiliations. I want to talk a little bit about some of the arguments that opponents make before also going into some of the arguments that proponents make. So opponents of term limits believe that elections enforce a natural voter-initiated term limit for elected leaders. Voter education, participation, and access to the ballot box allow voters to choose their elected officials. Voters are the ultimate deciders regarding how elected officials are held accountable for how they represent their constituents. In 2021, the League of Women Voters of Hudson, Ohio, restudied this issue when their city council sought to institute term limits and called term limits, quote, a voting rights issue that limits voter choice and affects elected representation that can be manipulated by partisan politics, end quote. Opponents also argue that term limits limit the effectiveness of the legislative body on which they are imposed. By setting a predetermined expiration date for elected officials, opponents argue that legislators are given an expiration date for when they can achieve policy reform, pass legislation, and gain the expertise necessary to ensure more laws that are good for the communities they serve are enacted. Finally, opponents of term limits argue that they would not drain the swamp of corrupt, power-hungry politicians, nor would they limit the corruption in Washington. This is federally, of course. Politicians are not corrupt because of how long they serve as legislators. They are corrupt because they choose to serve special interests rather than the constituents who elect them. Limiting the time they serve will only concentrate that corruption into a shorter period. Now let's look at the other side of the spectrum. Proponents of term limits see valid reasons for their enactment. One of the most common reasons cited by proponents is that running for election and dialing for dollars to fill the coffers of their campaigns and leadership PACs prohibits lawmakers from focusing on effective policymaking. Politicians often cite the amount of time they spend raising money as a detriment to the impact they can make on policy initiatives, especially here on Capitol Hill. Proponents argue that if term limits are instituted, elected officials would not need to fill their campaign war chests and would instead be able to focus their time on making needed policy changes via legislation. Proponents also argue that term limits would mandate fresh energy and ideas generated by a constant source of new legislators being added to the legislative process. New people and new ideas prevent the long-term entrenchment that career politicians are often prone to. Legislative turnover will prevent loyalty to bureaucracy and keep modern ideas in the mix as legislators figure out the best policies to implement for our growing communities. I think what proponents fail to realize in this space is that relationships with legislators, with constituents, and the communities they intend to serve are often the very reasons that policies move in the current overtly partisan atmosphere of legislative politics. Finally, proponents argue that term limits will increase the diversity of the candidate pool by allowing more women, Black, Brown, and other typically underrepresented communities to run for office. Proponents argue that term limits are designed to weaken the power of the incumbency and thus allow people from diverse backgrounds to seek opportunities for power and fair representation. The most recent paper I could find on this piece was from 2001 and was written by Susan J. Carroll and Krista Jenkins at Rutgers University. And the paper discussed whether women are more likely to run and be successful in an open seat created by term limits. Ultimately, the paper concluded that there was little data to support this argument, and additional research must be done to determine if candidates from underrepresented communities have more opportunities to run and win in a community that institutes term limits. The League of Women Voters has adopted a public policy around term limits. In 1991, the League announced its opposition to term limits for members of the US Congress federally because such limits would adversely affect the accountability, representativeness, and effective performance of Congress. And then by decreasing that power of Congress would upset the balance of power between Congress and an already very powerful presidency. The LWV membership has reaffirmed opposition to term limits on multiple occasions and authorized state and local leagues to use national positions to act on term limits for state and local offices. In 93 and 94, the leagues of Washington and Arkansas participated in suits challenging the state term limit laws based on the US Constitution. In 1995, after hearing the Arkansas case, the US Supreme Court agreed that term limits imposed by states on the US House and Senate are unconstitutional. Proposals to amend the Constitution to allow or set federal term limits failed to receive the necessary 2/3 majority in both houses, as I've already identified. The League has vigorously opposed the proposed amendment through testimony, lobbying, and grassroots action. In 1997, the League also successfully lobbied House members on this issue. In 1999, the National League and the League of Women Voters of Missouri filed an amicus brief in the U.S. Court of Appeals challenging a Missouri law requiring the phrase "disregarded voters" instruction on term limits to appear on the ballot next to any candidate's name who had not taken certain actions related to term limits. The appeals court struck down the law because it was a backdoor attempt to impose term limits and because it burdened the election process. Together, the League subsequently filed amicus briefs with the US Supreme Court when the case was considered on appeal. Term limits are just one policy used to fight the idea that there is widespread distrust of government officials. But citizens can demand the implementation of better policy alternatives to ensure trust in our elected officials, trust in our government, and accountability of all parties involved. I'm going to outline a couple of those things that could be considered alternatives. The first is reforming political spending and campaigns. The 2020 election saw the largest influx of cash of any election. And in fact, congressional election spending topped $8 billion. The amount of funding that goes into our campaigns is staggering. We can all agree on that. But legislative proposals to address the amount of money that candidates have to raise while also working to increase transparency for voters are available. Implementing small dollar contribution systems that match small dollar donations to candidates has long been cited as a reform that decreases candidate dependence on big money donors and limits the amount of dialing for dollars that candidates are required to conduct. Small dollar contribution systems are also proven to level the playing field and allow more women and candidates of color to participate in running for office. An additional reform around campaign spending includes disclosing donors, which will ensure that voters know who's behind the large contributions to candidates, thus shining a light on millions of dollars of dark money contributions given to candidates and any potential corrupting influences. Historically, politicians have also sought to manipulate and have manipulated the redistricting process to expand or protect their power, often to the detriment of the minority political party, to marginalized populations, and Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Allowing politicians to draw their districts by choosing the voters they need to retain their powerful legislative position threatens our democracy. Instead of working to limit the terms these legislators serve, basic reforms to increase transparency on the redistricting process, or better yet, put redistricting into the hands of voters or independent demographers, will ensure that voters are choosing their politicians and not the other way around. Finally, it's important to continue to fight voter suppression laws. Voter suppression is an attempt to prevent or discourage certain Americans from registering to vote or casting their ballots. These measures often target specific groups based on race, ethnicity, political affiliation, age, or other aspects of voters' identities. The most widely used forms of voter suppression include discriminatory voter ID and proof of citizenship restrictions, reduced polling place hours in communities of color, the elimination of early voting opportunities, and illegal purges of voters from the rolls. Like gerrymandering, a growing number of voter suppression laws in states across the country have sought to carve out the populations that have full access to voting, allowing legal discrimination in voting to occur. States should focus on expanding access to early voting, voter registration, same-day election day registration, and access to no excuse absentee mail-in ballots. While states can expand access federal reforms are still necessary to eliminate discrimination through the adoption of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the establishment of other federal standards to ensure the freedom to vote for all Americans. I want to conclude my remarks by reiterating that the League of Women Voters is opposed to term limits for federal legislators. I do represent that position here, but I have also tried to outline arguments for both sides of the issue. As you all consider the recommendations you are set to share with the Hawaii State House, I hope you will also consider some of the root issues that our democracy and our elections face. Term limits are just one idea of how legislative power can be addressed. However, we must be willing to take the necessary steps to protect our democracy and ensure it works for the people. In that case, we must make big changes that address the roots of our system, including reforms to money in politics, fighting discrimination in voting, and battling gerrymandering. Thank you again for the invitation to join you today. I'm happy to address any outstanding questions, concerns, or comments should they be needed now or in the future.
Thank you, Jessica. We have gone over our allowance for this, but we certainly enjoyed your remarks. We will take them to heart. And is there anyone with a quick question? Okay, thank you again, Jessica.
Thank you. Our next speaker is talking about the dominance of the one-party system and how it may affect the standards of conduct in our state legislature. Neil Milner is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Hawaii, where he has taught for over 40 years. He is also a columnist for Civil Beat and a regular contributor to Hawaii Public Radio's The Conversation. And he's also a political analyst for KITV. Neil, thank you for talking about the dominance of the one-party system here in Hawaii. Can you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity, and thanks for taking on this job, which is clearly gets harder as time goes on when you have all of these ideas that you have to parse and think about as possible solutions. So I'm going to talk about two questions. One question is, does party competition affect corruption? The answer is maybe. There is some general evidence. We know surprisingly little about this. There's some general evidence that from a lot of countries that the more competitive the parties are, the less corruption there is. It's not great, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt here. But the thing that's really important to understand here is how many people think that it is and how many people talk that way. The public and their position deserves to be recognized. If I write about anything involving politics in the state, and I say, I don't even have to say many things critical, the commentators tend to say the same thing. It's about corruption. It's about the political machine. It's the same old people all the time. Let's get rid of them. So let's give the benefit of the doubt to say that it might reduce corruption. People want to believe that. But the second question is really the more important one. And that is, can the level of or the lack of competitive parties in this state, the fact that we are such a strong one-party state, can that be changed by this commission? Are there fixes that you can make that would change it? And the answer is no. That this is a given. This is a given, I think, that the commission has to work with and strategize with that in the context rather than thinking that it's something you can fix. So let me talk a little bit more about the situation in Hawaii and more importantly, the reasons why this relationship is so hard to change. Some of it has to do with how people think about corruption, but a lot of it has to do with the nature of politics, which is every indication that things will stay the same in terms of party identification and voting rather than different. Let's start with this. Okay, so assume that there is a link between the one party, between party competition and the reduction of corruption. And the research seems to suggest that that link has to do with political parties being able to take a message and communicate information to the voters about what they think is going on, okay? That is almost non-existent for the Republican Party in this state. This is not about the competence of the Republican Party here. It's about the situation they found themselves into. If you think about their situation, in the entire legislature now, there are only, what, 5? In terms of the numbers in the legislature, that's been on the downslope for a number of years. There is no change along those lines. The party has really no kind of communications heft. We don't hear a lot about the Republican Party and what they believe. If you think about critics of the recent corruption, there isn't really a strong Republican Party presence. Part of that is because if you're a weak party, you have a weak infrastructure to do that. Part of it is that the media does an awful job in covering what political parties are like. They cover what elections are like. They talk about what parties do at elections and otherwise. But if you think about what do you know about what the Republican Party, what Republican voters are like at this stage, it's very little. So right there, you're losing a kind of key link between the voters who want more information and the situation, let's call it a corruption situation, where you're not getting a full and, let's say, nasty picture. The job of opposing parties is to call other parties accountable, to make issues when there just be statements. That's not really much a part of these kinds of politics at all. But let's look at why that's so hard to change. Why you really have to think about this as a given, not as a fix. The first thing is to understand what, well, here, let me give you another example. So when people say to me, we should have a viable two-party system, and I'll say, well, okay, why don't you vote for a Republican for a change? And there's silence because because voting in behalf of a two-party system is an abstract, general kind of argument that reflects disinterest rather than commitment to values. And so it isn't that very few people decide in, let's say, in my legislative district where there actually will be competition this time. And it's a heavily Democratic district. It never used to be, but it is now. I would guess there's only a handful of voters who say, you know what, I'm going to vote Republican this time because I want to see a viable two-party system. So part of the reason that you don't have that kind of behavior is the nature of the issue, but also the nature of the voter. But let's start with the idea of corruption itself. There's a whole lot of moral indignation about this. When the two legislators were caught taking money, there was all of this commotion about a culture of corruption, and that's how you got into it, and that's how the legislature got into it. But it seems to me that the history of corruption, reactions to corruption here and elsewhere, is there's a whole lot of moral indignation, but it doesn't necessarily last. And I'm already worrying about some bits of evidence that you're seeing here already about that. One of which is that the legislature took some of your early recommendations and voted for them and just kicked the can down the road for some of the other ones, including some of the important ones, I think you would say, in having to do with fundraising and access. But, excuse me, but there's another important thing here about, and one other issue where you see that is I was astounded by how little the discussion of hiring our new police chief was about trying to rid the police of corruption. To me, the most corrupt activities that we've seen in recent years in Hawaii had to do with with Kealoha and all of that other stuff, it was pretty much off the board. And not saying they're hiding anything, but all of a sudden that issue, which was very frightening and which came very close to not being discovered at all, has kind of disappeared from the agenda. So I think one thing about corruption is that it brings about a lot of indignation, but not necessarily a lot of staying power. Another thing though is remember that people are not single issue voters for the most part. And there are plenty of situations where people vote for someone that they think is corrupt because there are other values involved, because they have other things. Maybe the most clear of those examples, and probably the most outrageous, have to do with some of these are Republican Congress people who were charged and went to jail on corruption kind of stuff and were able to win their seats back. So that's an exaggerated situation, but remember how you choose to vote. You're not likely to vote for a Republican if you're the average voter, just because the Democrat is corrupt. It depends. The corruption is a factor in that. And one of the ways that legislators lose if they're corrupt is that they get primaried, that you get other candidates who run on that issue. But it's not necessarily a game changer. Now, let's look more closely at some other reasons why this movement away, why trying to change this competitiveness is a problem. First of all, the movement in national politics, and what I mean by national politics, I mean across the nation, is for more attachment to the party you vote for rather than less attachment. You know, you see these surveys about the increase in independent voters. That's what people say, but if the way you decide how independent people are is that you look at their voting histories, and almost a very large percentage of independents consistently will vote one way or the other. So that the first thing is that we are at a stage in our history right now where party identification, identifying with one party, which means you're not likely to change, is extraordinarily strong. It's called hyperpartisanship, or the more accurate and scary term is negative party identification. You decide how to vote so that you're voting against the party you abhor. And that's the dominant way that things are going right now. Politics has become more nationalized. That is, issues that used to be pretty much local issues. And the Lingo administration had a lot more of these before things began to become nationalized. Issues now have become local issues, have become nationalized. Transit would be much more a nationalized issue now here than it was then, because you have national organizations and political parties taking positions on those kind of local things. So what does that mean? It means that there is even less incentives to change your vote. Finally, you know, we have these new forms of elections, most of which I find interesting and I think are improving. There is nothing in these things that, from what we know, that will necessarily bring about increase in party competition. The jungle primary, the ones where you keep eliminating the ones that are lower down, they change politics in some ways, but we know from experience in California and elsewhere, they're not really changing the distribution of parties. Think about what would have to do that here. Think about some kind of electoral process that would move the distribution of 51 seats, let's say, in the House to something from that was 47-4 to something that's, I don't know, let's say 30-21 with the 21 in the majority, or even 32-19, because that was the last Republican high point. That's an extraordinary change given these kinds of situations. So again, this is not talking about the future of the Republican Party or Trumpism or the split in the party or Republican Party. What's next? It's about simple numbers, simple political psychology. The Republican Party, as a matter of fact, looking toward the next state election, has done pretty well. it's filled more seats with candidates than normal. But think about a district that, as a lot of districts are here, a legislative district, state legislative district, that's 65%, it votes consistently 65% Democratic. That's almost twice as many Democrats as Republicans. Think about what it would take to turn that around in any kind of significant sort of way. So I guess what I'm really saying is that the issue of why we're a one-party state is about political psychology. It's about an entrenched history, and it's about a situation that really can't be manipulated in the short run. There isn't anything that you can say that says, do something else. Okay, but I don't want to make this sound like some kind of snotty academic or snotty retired academic remark saying, you know, a pox on all your houses. I think that's important to understand for you, because you're getting, just as you've seen today, 1,000,001 suggestions about what has to be done. A lot of these suggestions are good. Whether they have anything to do with reducing corruption, I don't know. And part of your job is not just to say they're good or they're bad, it's whether it's within your task to do it. So I'm suggesting to you that you have to think about the context as a one-party dominant system with one of the largest political leans or partisan leans in the country. That is, we're more democratic than maybe 3 or 4 other states. What it means is that you have to figure out, I think, how and what you can help with that takes the place for the near and maybe not so near future of a opposition party that acts in a powerful way to call people of the other party accountable. And I want to stress again, this is not at all about the Republican Party's competence. It's not even about its ideology. I mean, we can have that argument another time, although I prefer not, I prefer never to have that kind of argument. But the point is that to me is the situation that you face.
Thank you for your really insightful comments, and you gave us a lot to think about. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Neil, thanks so much for joining us. I've enjoyed your commentary and opinion over the years.
Thank you.
If the Republican Party retained you to advise them on how to reverse course and gain some seats in the legislature and maybe a statewide office, maybe not in the next year or two, what sort of advice would you give them?
Hey, to show you how desperate this situation is, they actually tried this once, because one of the chairs of the Republican Party had been a student in my seminar, and we talked about that. I mean, I think I have, well, I have 3 things. First of all, I'm not a consultant. I'm not good at that. Secondly, though, I think there's a couple of things. One of which is that you really have to move one candidate, one election at a time, one district at a time. I remember talking to the chair of the party maybe 10 or 15 years ago, a really smart guy. And he said, you know what the problem is? We can't get a candidate to run twice. It's hard enough for a Republican to take on running in a highly Democratic district, that is almost all of them. But there's a good chance that they're going to lose the first time. And what you do is you develop a network and you develop some experience. But the problem is it costs you time, it costs you money, and it's very discouraging. But I think one of the things that they have to work on is to try to figure out the incentives to get people to run again. The final thing, and I've talked about this before, it's almost, this is mainly pre-Trump, and this takes on a whole different meaning now. I talked about the party thinking more of itself as a social movement. You know, when Republican parties, when any political parties have turned things around in other states, when the conservatives in California built themselves up into a viable political party, when the South went Republican, it had to do a lot with kind of grassroots organizing that didn't just have to do with the candidate, with elections and so on. It had to do with newspapers, it had to do with movements, it had to do with joining churches. You know, for a place that's Ohana oriented and thinks about itself as a community, there's precious little of that kind of stuff. We've become kind of, we lose interest in politics until it's election time. And what I think Republicans have to do is to fill in that gap pre-election. Would I vote for a Republican then? Well, maybe. I'm one of those people. I mean, you know me, I'm kind of left of center. Would I vote? And I voted Republican before. I don't know if that's enough to get me to turn around, especially in this kind of situation. But there really isn't any kind of good alternative. Oh, and one other quick thing. You hear these arguments all the time that the party should move toward the center. And my feeling about that is, what are you talking about here? If you're going to be like another Democratic Party, what's the point? You have ideals, you have values, you have, I mean, that doesn't mean Republicans shouldn't compromise, but you know, you're involved in politics to some extent because of your sense of integrity, a sense of what you believe. And so it isn't that you can just kind of cut this off. It's funny to say this right now in a situation where national politics is such despair because no one compromises. That's free advice, so the Republicans don't have to pay me.
Okay, thank you, Neil.
You're welcome.
All right, now we turn to the question of whether having informed voters can help in the matter of improving standards of conduct. Our first speaker is Donna Oba. She's from the League of Women Voters of Hawaii. Donna is also president. She's president of the State League, and she's also president of, or an officer in the Hawaii County League. She's been active with the League for years. Over the past 8 years, in particular, she's been the champion of Vote 411, which is the League's customized voter education program. Previously, she worked as a financial planner. She's been very active on the boards of other nonprofits. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Janet. And thank you, Commission, for doing the work that you're doing and for this opportunity to talk about voter education and access. As Janet said, I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Hawaii. I'm actually on the Honolulu board this time. I've been on the Hawaii County board, but right now I'm serving on Honolulu's board. Let's make it really clear, to make democracy work, you need educated voters and access to voting. This has always been a priority of the League. It's what we've been doing for over 70 years in Hawaii, and we've been an organization in the US for over 100 years. So we believe that democracy works when government is open, transparent, responsive, and accountable. And so in a representative democracy, decisions are not made directly by voters, but they're made by leaders chosen by voters. And these leaders make decisions that affect our daily lives. So to give voters more information so that they might choose carefully, the National League, as Janet said, provides an election website, Vote 411. It's currently used in all 50 states and tens of millions of voters use it. And the Hawaii County League actually began using it 10 years ago in 2012, and we've been statewide since 2016. The advantage of it, it's free. It's free to Hawaii candidates. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what this elections information website looks like. So thanks, Rona. All you need to do to access the website is type in vote 411, vote411.org. So I want to point out that we're seeing the guide in English, but it also is available in Spanish, and other languages are under consideration. So there's a lot of links on this homepage and every page that you'll see. There's register to vote. You can register to do that online through Vote 411, verify voter registration. And you can find out what's on your own personal ballot. So if you scroll down a little bit further, you put in your address in order to get your personal ballot. But I just want to show that they also have more voting information, and you can find it for any state in the US. So we're not going to put it, oh, let's hold off on that right now, Rona. Let's scroll down a little bit for voting information by state. As you can see, you can either drop down and click on Hawaii, or you can hover over the map and just click on the state. There you go. And let's look at what's there. One of the first things we want to make sure people know are the deadlines to register to vote, when the elections are. But then there's a lot more information as you scroll down for all about voting in Hawaii. And we've got links for with information about early voting, election dates and registration deadlines, eligibility requirements, voter ID requirements, polling places and hours, and then we'll have links to candidate forums. Let's click on eligibility requirements and see what that says. There we go. And so that just lists what you need to do in order to become a voter in Hawaii, and includes information about pre-registering to vote. There's also a link on campaign finance information. And those have links to federal information and the state elections website. Go ahead and click on that. And it's on this website that the Office of Elections has a link to the Campaign Spending Commission. So we can close that and go back to Vote 411. Thank you. Now, to get back to the home page, you just scroll to the top and just click on the Vote 411 icon. Navigation's pretty simple. And now we're going to do our personalized ballot. So you can see what sort of information is available. So we're going to use the address of the state capitol. Just type that in. Hit submit. And the first thing I want you to see is that you can change the address from this point. If you made a mistake in typing, just click on that. It doesn't take you to another screen. It just does a pop-up. You can make your change. Again, we repeat the address, or I'm sorry, the deadlines and dates that are important. But then we can go to our voter guide. Because we have partisan races in the primary, you can choose to only look at candidates from a party, or you can do what we're going to do is show all of them, because I want to see all the candidates. And then we'll go to my races. And the ballot will show the different races. In the 2022 primary, there's going to be 11 races if you live in Honolulu or Hawaii counties, and there's going to be 12 because of mayoral races in Maui and Kauai. So let's look at the governor. Now, first thing that you see is a description of the duties and the qualifications, how they get elected, the term of service and of term of office and the base salary. And then because we said show all, we're going to see all 19 candidates or the names of them. If there's a photo, there's a good likelihood they've responded. So we're still working on that. We're a little behind in that. So let's click on a candidate. Okay, so as you scroll down, there are that candidate's answers. There's some bio questions with links to their websites or emails or contact information. Then they have answers to their responses. Now, if we go back up, we find that the other candidates have this word compare button beneath them. So we can compare the answers to our questions between two candidates. Now, why only two? Well, we think that a lot of our new voters are accessing the internet by their phone. So anything more than answers by two candidates gets to be a little overwhelming for the phone. And we also encourage candidates to have very brief answers. So we do limit the number of characters per answer. So let's scroll down a little bit more. And there are more links and more information. And we have something called upcoming debates and forums. So if the league or other organizations that are nonpartisan have public debates, we will post them on this page, or actually on other pages as well. And if you scroll down even more, there's additional resources, because I wanted to point a couple of things out. We try not to reinvent the wheel. And one of the things that we're very happy to see the State Office of Elections do is have this feature called Track Your Ballot. We're not going to click on that, but I just want to say this is a great feature, because in the 2020 elections with all mail voting, one of the most common questions the league was asked was, how do I know that my ballot was received? And this is going to allow them to do that. The other item that we like on the elections website that we find very informative is the video on Hawaii elections explained. It's less than 6 minutes. It's a great video. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And we will have those links in different places on our website, because we don't, like I say, want to reinvent the wheel, and there are a lot of things. So that's pretty much it. Let's return to the home screen. Again, scrolling to the top and clicking on the icon. So that's pretty much Vote 411 in a nutshell. Just to be real clear about what Vote 411 includes, we only show candidates in the primary election. In the general election, we also have ballot measures, and they're such as proposed constitutional amendments or proposed county charter amendments. And the league may post pros and cons on the proposed measures if they provide that. So again, we've been using Vote 411 since 2012. Candidate participation is slowly growing over the years. And we had the highest candidate response in 2020, with like 89% of Hawaii County candidates participating in the primary. Maui had 80%, Kauai 76%, statewide was 80%. Honolulu was kind of behind the rest of them with 41%, but overall nearly 2/3 of all candidates who were running in the primary election participated in Vote 411. So voter education and these kinds of websites are just a tool, because we really find that the voters need to know who they're electing to make decisions that affect our life. And the elections are our only chance to stand up for what matters to us and to have an impact on the issues that affect our communities, our families, and our future. I shouldn't say only there, but it's one of the biggest. So having elections websites are a good start to giving voter more information. And with more information, voters can better decide who will stand up for them. So your work improving standards of conduct are also a good start to assuring voters that the leaders they choose will stand up for them and not for special interests. So thank you for this opportunity again to talk about one of the tools that the League of Women Voters uses in making democracy work.
Thank you, Donna. Any questions?
I do, Janet. Donna, thank you so much for the work you do and for spending some time with us today. Do you have any measurement of the number of people that are accessing your website and navigating it as you explained?
Well, for a state our size, we're comparable to other states, let's say that way. We get about 20,000 sessions going, and primarily in the primary, more than we do for the general. So we have a very limited ad budget. It's primarily word of mouth and community newsletters and organizations. And we hope that the candidates themselves will promote it. But we'd like to see that number grow substantially.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Donna, it's Kristen, Izumi Tao campaign spending. So
Okay.
I know on the Office of Elections, there's a campaign finance component, but I guess we should talk more because our campaign spending website has searchable data. It has live geo maps. So it's a much more robust system that's real time. So you're going to see all the reports, the data dumped in there, and you can refine it. You can look at where the money is coming from, who's giving the money, and you can see the percentages of in a nice pie chart. So very good graphics of where the money is being spent. So I think we could add another element to that. Again, we'd have to talk more because we are a state agency. You are a nonprofit.
Yes, and Vote 411 is really created by our 501c3, the League of Women Voters Education Fund.
Okay, but if you can take a look at our website and go to candidate committees and non-candidate committees and look at the searchable databases, I think you'll be really pleased to see the dashboards because they're very colorful. What's great about it is it's real time. So anytime there's a report due, you'll see a data dump in there and you'll see like how many, right now we're at 15.29 million total contributions received for that was the 2020 race, but we'll have it for the 2022 race. There's 3.95 million contributions received, total expenses at 2.06 million, total loans received at 204,000, blah, 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 blah. So it really drills down to all the races. And ideally, the idea here is in alignment with yours, which is informed voting. We encourage candidates to do their opposition research, look at their opposing candidate, whoever, as well as their own, and look and see who's giving the money and how they're spending the money. And these are great graphics that I think the media know how to use. So it's just further enhancement of what Vote 411 is about. But we can talk more offline.
I'd appreciate that. I'll probably contact your office in the coming weeks and get that on there. Thank you. It's a great idea.
I think if there are no other questions, we can move on to the second presenter about voter education.
So thank you. We're continuing with voter education and how an educated electorate can help improve standards of conduct. Our last presenter is Raymond DeVega with the Hawaii State Office of Elections. The Hawaii State Office of Elections provides secure, accessible, and convenient election services to voters statewide. One of the responsibilities of the Office of Elections is to provide education and outreach so that voters understand how to register to vote and the information about elections. Raymond has worked in the voter services section of the Office of Elections since 2014. He specializes in voter education and outreach, including messaging for the office's media campaigns and working with community groups. You can see from one of the slides that's a part of this presentation that several bills were introduced in the 2020 session about voter education, and none of them had made it through the 2020 session. But Ray could give more of a presentation about Office of Elections, voter services, and discuss the importance of educating voters. Thank you, Ray, for being here today.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to the Commission for inviting our office to speak on the topic of voter education. Again, my name is Raymond DeVega, and I'm with the Voter Services section at the Office of Elections. Rona, next slide, please. Thank you. So in today's presentation, we'll cover the following. What are the objectives of voter education? What obstacles or problem areas exist? What education tactics are utilized in Hawaii? And what does the future of voter education entail? Okay, so what are the objectives of voter education? Number one is to raise awareness about the voter services available to all Hawaii residents. The second objective is to be sure that Hawaii residents are educated on the mechanics of voting. And as we are an apolitical office, we maintain that our role in voter education is not campaigning, but instead our objective is to educate Hawaii residents on the voting process. A successful voter education plan ensures that basic election information is widespread and easily accessible. Okay, so voter education needs to address the following: how to register to vote, how to verify and update an existing voter registration, how to vote by mail, and provides voters with information on election security. So when carrying out our voter education plan, there are several obstacles we are faced with. This includes having the ability to reach broad audiences as well as targeted audiences, addressing how to maintain voter engagement outside of the election cycle, and identifying effective messaging. So in the next section, we'll examine how Hawaii's voter education plan attempts to address these obstacles. So our approach to voter education relies on a wide mix of tactics. Because voters have different styles of learning, we believe that the most effective strategy is to reach voters through different access points. Our tactics include hosting in-person events, conducting virtual events, creating voter education materials, the use of social media and paid media, as well as our voter hotline, news releases, and election mailings. Next slide, please. Thank you. So participating in in-person events allows us to meet voters where they already are, giving voters convenient access to election services. We conduct voter registration booths at community events, fairs and expos, on college campuses, and have hosted pop-up events as pictured here. Applicants can register to vote on the spot, make updates to the registration, and have a chance to speak on one-on-one with our staff. So this photo here is from an information booth we hosted at Kapolei Commons to celebrate National Voter Registration Day. So prior to the pandemic, we participated in over 40 events during the election cycle. Fortunately, we are seeing a gradual return to in-person activity and have participated in a number of events this year, including the Hospitality and Tourism Expo. We've done tabling at UH Manoa and UH West Oahu. And most recently, we were at the Hawaii Symphony's Outdoor Concert Series. So next in the mix are virtual events. As we were forced to shift outreach methods during the height of the pandemic, we embraced the use of virtual events. It was especially important for us to continue being accessible, given 2020 was Hawaii's first year with statewide voting by mail. So through the live event feature on Facebook, we hosted a monthly online session called Ask an Election Official. And in these sessions, we explored timely topics and attendees were able to submit questions in the live chat. We've continued to use virtual events and virtual outreach since 2020 and have since hosted Zoom presentations and for several community groups this election cycle, including sessions with students and disability groups. So next in our voter education mix is the library of voter ed content we've produced and made available online at elections.hawaii.gov. I know Donna mentioned some of them earlier. But in November of last year, we launched a YouTube series called the Hawaii Votes Program, where every month we focus on one major election topic, such as voting accessibility or election security. And other voter education materials include an explainer video that walks voters through the elections process, a vote by mail guide, which is pictured here, and an archive of our monthly newsletter. So next in our mix is our use of social media. We maintain accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we post deadlines, promote registration opportunities, and connect voters to online resources such as the online registration system and sample ballots. So we are able to reach a large audience through paid media advertising, which includes television, radio, and print ads. Our 2022 media campaign began earlier this year to raise awareness about voter notification cards. This month's messaging is focused on voter registration, how to verify and update your registration, and promoting the newly launched ballot status tracker. Messaging for the remainder of the year includes alerting voters of ballot deadlines, same-day registration, and ballot drop boxes. So how do we address reaching targeted audiences? One of the ways that we are able to do so is through our community partnerships. So these partnerships have allowed us to reach groups including senior citizens, students, disability communities, and houseless individuals. We were able to grow our audience through these networks and provide tailored voter education to meet the needs of these groups. For example, houseless voters and their service providers have a different set of questions than maybe a senior citizen may have. So how does someone register to vote if they don't have a traditional residence address or state-issued ID? These are questions we can address to ensure that every voter has information that is most relevant to them. Pictured here is a recent partnership we had with Olelo Community Media, where we sponsored a student video contest. Students were challenged to create videos on election topics, allowing them to learn about Hawaii's voting process and pre-registration for young voters. So what does the future of voter education in Hawaii possibly entail? Tracking the progress of election-related bills in the 2022 legislative session, it appears that voter pamphlets may be something of the near future and may be the next piece in Hawaii's mix of education tactics. SB 3226, 2210, and House Bill 124 all provided the framework for how a voter pamphlet may be implemented. So in conceptualizing Hawaii's voter pamphlet, we looked to other states and researched local resources that could serve as a guide. Pictured here is a candidate guide produced for a local delegation election. And in conceptualizing the guide, some of the parameters we established include that a voter pamphlet is to be mailed to every occupied household and PO box. Because we envision that the guide is to include basic voter ed information, by delivering it to every household rather than to just registered voters, we can provide more access points to election info. Additionally, we envision hosting a digital version of the pamphlet on our website. And regarding promotion, we recommend running print and radio ads for the general public, as well as running ads in multicultural media to promote translated materials as well. Pictured here is an example layout of the pamphlet with 4 candidates appearing on a page. Candidates would be permitted to provide a 150-word statement, which would be submitted at the time of candidate filing. So with this layout, the primary election guide, we estimate to be around 96 pages, totaling $634,350. And with a general election guide, we estimate that to be around 86 pages, totaling $583,450. So bringing the total projected cost for the primary and general election to be around $1.2 million. As a note, this would include the production, printing, and postage. So how do we move forward? We believe that the key to educating Hawaii's voters is through continued community effort. Moving forward, we will continue to build on community networks to allow us to reach targeted groups, continue to listen to voters and diversify voter education tactics in order to meet their needs, and encourage greater participation from the community and amplify their efforts. Thank you again to the commission. I'm here for any questions.
I have a question, if I could.
Yes, go ahead.
Raymond, thank you for the work you do. It's very important. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. Question I have for you, how does Hawaii compare to other states as far as the percent that register to vote, eligible voters, registering to vote, and voting turnout? How do we compare with other states?
You know, I can't speak on the comparison to other states, but I do know that in this most recent election, the voter turnout has increased. And we would attribute that to the move to vote by mail, providing easier access, more entry points to the election process, making it more convenient. Those are all contributing factors to the increase in this past election.
Is there anything that comes to mind that you haven't mentioned in your presentation that would encourage more people to register to vote?
I think one of the focuses we have is with the pre-registration, because Hawaii is unique in that we allow 16-year-olds to pre-register before being eligible to vote at 18. one of our focuses is our young voter registration program, where we provide the registration opportunity to high school juniors and seniors. And I think that's a real growth opportunity for the registration, to encourage the youth to get involved at an early age and build that habit early on, so that they are eligible right away and the ballot gets to them once they turn 18. So I think that is a real growth opportunity, and something that our community as a whole can work on, encouraging the youth to participate, as well as our office. So programs such as a young voter registration program.
Thank you very much. Barbara?
I have a question regarding
Mm-hmm.
purging the voter list.
Mhm.
How do you purge the list?
Okay, so the election, I just want to back up for a second. So the maintenance of the voter registration list is an ongoing process. We use election mailings in order to identify outdated addresses. So an example of that is, number one, your mail ballot, or it could be your notice of voter registration. So I don't know if you recall from early in the year, but you might have received a notice in the mail confirming your voting district, that you're registered to vote. So what happens is, if that notification is undeliverable and is sent back to the County Elections Division, your voter record would be flagged. And a second notification will be sent that would be forwardable, allowing you to update your registration. If that is, again, returned to the County Elections Division, that would flag your record as inactive, and your record would need to be inactive for 2 election cycles in order to be removed. I do also want to note that we encourage family members, if someone has moved or if there is a death in the family, to contact the County Elections Division directly. You can always make that notice directly with the counties in order to have that voter's record removed.
So you must have 2 notifications returned to you as undeliverable, and then you have to wait for 2 election cycles to pass.
Correct.
So that's 4 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So 2 general elections.
Is there any federal law that restricts you from purging for so many years?
Not, what do you mean by that? Restricts us from?
It seemed to me in the 90s, Hawaii had to put some voters back on because they had purged some names and some voters. And because the federal law had required you to keep the names on for so many years.
Not to my knowledge. I'm not familiar with what you're referring to.
Does anybody check the obituaries or?
So we do get regular updates from the Department of Health as well. I believe those are forwarded to the County Elections Division. I do want to make clear that it is the County Elections Division that is responsible for managing the voter registration records. And that information, I believe, is shared with between the Department of Health and the counties.
Okay, you believe, but are you sure?
Yes, yes. I apologize, I misspoke. That information is shared with the County Elections Division.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we can move on to prescriptive discussion issues. We have a little less than a half hour left for our meeting. So I'm going to go through these ideas, which Sandy and I came across as prospects for improvement in legislator conduct. They are all driven by recent bills introduced in the legislature. The first is prohibiting agents of candidates from assisting voters. For a long time, it has always been illegal for candidates to assist voters, but directly. In 2019, there was an amendment to section 1139 of our statutes to prohibit candidates from assisting voters in person. Right now, candidates may help with written or oral instructions for their for voters that are received by telephone, electronic means, but they cannot do anything like this in person. And of course, that's to avoid voter intimidation. Senate Bill 216 related to elections would tighten this up to extend this kind of restriction to agents of candidates. And agents of candidates in this bill is defined as a person who receives compensation from the candidate's committee, or is an official officer of the candidate committee. Now, it is not always the case that a candidate's agent is compensated, but you will see that this bill proposed an extension so that an official officer of the candidate committee would also be restricted. Okay, our second idea had to do with Senate Bill 1268 relating to election campaigns. This bill proposed that the Code of Fair Campaign Practices would be voluntarily put in place to so that candidates pledge to conduct their campaigns consistent with the code. Now, I remember that the Campaign Spending Commission has previously had experience with trying to use this in terms of campaign spending, and that there was at least some legal difficulty at the Anchetta case. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess the idea here is try again, but Kristen, do you have anything to add here?
No, other than anybody, who wants to move this type of code forward should take good measure of the federal case that struck down some programming of this nature in 2001 in the Anchetta versus Watada case.
Okay, thank you. So any legislation would need to be crafted carefully, I guess. The last idea that Sandy and I wanted to bring up is regarding remedies for faithless electors. A faithless elector is a person who has been selected by the party to cast a ballot with the federal Electoral College, thank you. The Federal Electoral College, and who does not choose the candidate who appears on the general election ballot for that party. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but in 2016, Hawaii did have a so-called faithless elector when one of the Democratic electors decided to choose Bernie Sanders instead of Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine. This was against the law. It was against the law at the time, but the problem is there are no remedies for what happens if someone behaves this way. And this bill proposes two things. It would invalidate the elector's vote for failure to follow the party winner. And it would also require an elector to vote in place of the original elector. So put some teeth into the idea of having faithless electors illegal. Yes, okay. I think I'll stop there so that perhaps we can get to the last part of the program. And Sandy, any questions before we move ahead? Barbara.
Yeah, I was going back to the elections, assisting voters and elections.
Right.
Is that a problem here in Hawaii?
I'm not aware of a specific problem, but the intent, I think, was to tighten up the current law. which was, if you recall, the law was amended in 2019 in response to allegations of improper voter assistance to certain voters.
I'm not familiar with the 2019 incident,
Mhm.
but we do have a 1,000-foot radius around polling places.
Right,
In which you can't have signs or
Right,
T-shirts or
right.
brochures,
right,
even water.
right.
Barbara, we have, I won't mention the name, but we had a very well publicized case where a candidate graciously was helping people fill in their ballots, their mail-in ballots. And now that it's
Yeah, that's
basically
terrible.
mail-in balloting, that's an issue. But we had a highly publicized case where a candidate was doing it.
And this is perhaps, as Dan mentioned, even more important in the vote by mail scenario where people actually have the ballots in their homes and, we really can't have any of the candidates going to their homes and pressuring them or anything like that.
Oh, I see.
Any other questions? If not, let's turn to our last section for today's program. Sandy?
Thanks, Janet. So these are just some issues that we came across to address improving standards of conduct. One is ranked choice voting. This was suggested that ranked choice voting may be able to improve standards of conduct. There is a bill that was passed by the 2022 legislative session, 2022 legislature, and is pending before Governor Ige. So this has to do with ranked choice voting for special federal elections and special vacant county council seats. And this bill, ranked choice voting in general, has been discussed as improving campaigning for those running for office, and that it would tone down the rhetoric. It's been seen in other jurisdictions of toning down the rhetoric, because instead of just having to convince your special segment of people who would vote for you, that you would have to convince a broader voting segment to vote for you. And so it would tone down the rhetoric. And that's why ranked choice voting has been touted as improving the standards of conduct. It's also been suggested that Hawaii look at a unicameral legislature. Hawaii is bicameral. There is only one state in the nation that's unicameral, and that is Nebraska. And so Common Cause has a Nebraska chapter, and I reached out to the Nebraska chapter to find out if unicameral legislature can improve standards of conduct. And we had a nice little discussion, and it was thought that a unicameral legislature moves very quickly. Bills could be passed very quickly. And Hawaii legislature moves very fast already. So a unicameral legislature can move even faster. And also a bicameral legislature, one house can act as a check on the other house. And so there's not a check in the unicameral legislature, and it's only the governor that can act as a check, is what I was told. And so those are some issues to consider if we want to investigate a unicameral legislature and some more. It's said that the unicameral legislature has less members than a bicameral legislature, and so that it may be easier to keep an eye out on individual state legislators who could be bad actors. But still, Nebraska has its own issues in terms of transparency and in terms of accountability. So those are the concerns that were raised by my counterpart in Nebraska. So those are the issues that we presented here for discussion. So thank you very much, and free to have more discussions by the commissioners and the public. Thank you.
You want to add one item, Janet?
Yes, if there's time, I would like to add one additional item under the prescriptive possibility for consideration. That's initiative, referendum, and recall, which does tie into the matter of elections and voting. Initiative refers to the process whereby voters could directly put a ballot measure or a charter amendment on the ballot. Referendum refers to taking action to remove a recently passed measure from the books. And recall refers to removing a sitting legislator from office. Now, what these three approaches have in common is that they all go around the legislature. There was a bill in the 2020 session that proposed that Hawaii have initiative, referendum, and recall, but that bill didn't advance very far. Initiative and referendum exist in about 26 states, so roughly half of the states at the state level. And recall is less popular. I believe it's 16 states. And interestingly, Hawaii's counties already have initiative provisions, and it seems used fairly often. On the other hand, we have to guard against what's happened in California, where voters are, is it fair to say, somewhat plagued by or overloaded with initiative measures. So, but that matter probably deserves a little more consideration than we can give it today.
Okay, so we'll proceed with the discussion on all these items. I'd like to begin with initiative and referendum. I've had some experience representing people in that area, for example, the Save Sandy Beach initiative, and spoken on it. And it's really a double-edged sword. You know, the movement began in Oregon as a populist movement, people's movement, but the experience in California in particular has shown a very cluttered ballot, to a large degree dominated by special interests, with initiatives blocked to be placed on the ballot. But as Janet pointed out, we do have some experience here at the county level, and it seems to have been used somewhat intelligently and not abused. It has been raised in the three constitutional conventions we've had, 1950, 68, and 78, and the delegates didn't move it forward. The only thing I would suggest, if we're going to move forward and discuss the initiative and referendum, in my civil rights career, I represented minorities, and I would be very reluctant to allow the Constitution to be amended by initiative or referendum, as it was, you know, by the legislature to deny the LGBTQ community equal protection under the law. So if it were to be considered, I'd like to, at least at the state level, limit it to statutes, so the minority groups still would be afforded protection under the Constitution. That's all I have, Jen.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions?
Okay, I think, you know, overall, first of all, Janet, Sandy, thank you so much for putting this session together. The slideshow, which is on our webpage, so those tuning in to YouTube, they can go back and refresh your memories. You can submit, we've had testimony earlier today, but any of those that are still with us or watching it on YouTube can submit written testimony on anything they've heard today, and we will review it. I would suggest we move everything forward on today's agenda for discussion purposes, except the unicameral legislature. One, I don't think our legislature is going to eliminate one of its houses. And if it does come, we'll have a tough enough time with term limits if we move that forward, as opposed to unicameral legislature. I think, will that be best discussed if we have another constitutional convention? The question will be on the ballot soon, whether or not we should have one. And I think that would be the appropriate place for it to be discussed. But I think all the items today have merit. We should continue to discuss them and solicit input from the public. Other commissioners, Janet, do you have any final comments?
Not really. We had to rush a little bit at the end there. So the 4 bills that were mentioned definitely, I think, deserve more consideration. And thank you.
Sandy, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you.
Barbara?
We did talk about extending the ranked choice to other offices or for primaries, voting in primaries. I didn't see that on here.
No, that is certainly an option to talk about. We were really just reviewing what ranked choice voting is and what the new bill is, but you're right. Many states, Australia, I know, uses ranked choice voting in all their elections, so worthy of discussing.
Or the case when the primary, you vote on the top 2 in a party. And
I think, Barbara, you're talking about jungle primary in California and in New Orleans. I mean, sorry, in Louisiana.
yes, there's 2 types. There would be within a primary for the same party or across party lines. Take the top 2 regardless of party. So
Yeah, so in Louisiana, they have this what they call a jungle primary system, in which everyone across the board, you vote for all the candidates at once in November. And if the top 2, so it's the jungle primary, and the top 2, if no one reaches 50%, the top 2 go to a runoff in December. And that's what happens in Louisiana. And in California, the system is a jungle primary, whereas the primary and everyone votes, and regardless of the candidate that reaches majority or not, the top 2 goes off into a runoff in November.
well, I thought that would be worthy of further discussion, but then, I'm only one person.
Oh, no, I mean, that's certainly something that could be discussed further.
The important democratic principle behind ranked choice voting is that it strives to make sure that at least one candidate receives more than 50% of the vote. Because without that arrangement, it's possible for a candidate in a crowded race, a candidate can win who has not received 50% of the vote.
I think, if we want, we're talking about dominance of one party, and I think it would change some of the players if we had that voting system, at least within primaries. I think it's worth exploring.
I think you're right.
Thank you.
Okay, is Kristen still with us? Did you have any comments, Kristen?
I believe she had to leave.
Okay, she had to leave. So if no further comments, we'll move on to other matters. Our next meeting is June 29, 2 p.m. That's a Wednesday, in person in this room, 309, and also via Zoom. The issue will be campaign finance reform. I would like to thank Gary Husert and Coco Yomoto for joining us on testimony. I'd like to thank others for watching it today. For those who have submitted their written testimony, please stay with us in the coming weeks and months. Your participation is greatly appreciated.
Chair Foley, I'm sorry, I will be absent for the next meeting. And I'm really interested in campaign finance, especially the problem of PACs and super PACs and hybrid PACs because of the secrecy of the donors and because of the large amounts of money that just skews our politics. It overshadows parties and candidates' funds and really, I think it's created kind of a political plutocracy. So I know it's difficult to overturn legally, but I think people should be educated about it. You know, maybe in the future there will be a change.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. If no further comments, meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.